All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Fireside chat with William MacAskill and Tom Davidson. Uh, William and Tom are both co-founders at the soon-to-be-announced Forethought Center for AI Strategy. So we're lucky to get a sneak preview today of what they've been thinking about and working on. This will mostly be a Q&A, so would encourage you right now to open up Swapcard on your phone or device, click on that live interaction button, and there'll be a chat. You can put questions that you'd like me to ask William and Tom, or just upvote questions that are already there to make sure that I get the ones that are most interesting to our audience first. If you are still curious to ask more and talk to William and Tom after, there'll be office hours upstairs in Junior Ballroom 4, which is just right up the escalators. So I'll turn it over to William and Tom to give us a brief about what they've been thinking about for the last few months shortly, but a first introduction to each of them. So William MacAskill is an associate professor in philosophy at the University of Oxford. At the time of his appointment at Oxford, he was the youngest associate professor of philosophy in the world. He's co-founded nonprofits that you might have heard of, like Giving What We Can, the Center for Effective Altruism, 80,000 Hours. He's also the author of What We Owe the Future, Doing Good Better, and Moral Uncertainty. Tom is a senior research analyst at Open Philanthropy. He is currently working on assessing whether AI could lead to significant and long-lasting concentrations of power. Prior to joining Open Phil, Tom worked as a data scientist for education technology at a startup in the UK and taught science at a comprehensive school there. He has a master's in physics and philosophy from the University of Oxford. All right, so Will, do you want to start us off? Just give us a few minutes on what you've been thinking about lately. And
Sure. So Tom and I are co-founding this new research institute called the Forethought Center for AI Strategy, along also with Max Dalton, who used to run Center for Effective Altruism, and Amrit Sidhu Brar. And we also have other researchers employed or we're working with, including Toby Ord, Lizka Vainfarb, who's in the audience, Finn Morehouse, and Bose Hadjtar. And it's kind of like a spiritual successor to Future of Humanity Institute, also very aligned with kind of Open Phil's Worldview Investigations team, and we're even poaching Tom from that. And it's trying to work on the biggest picture, but yet most neglected issues that are going to arise if AI drives truly rapid technological change, potentially in the very near term. And so we're going to launch on 11th of March or thereabouts. And in terms of what I've been working on, I've got this like 5.5-hour ATK podcast where you can hear more mid-March. Maybe that'll get cut down. It won't be 4.5 hours or something. But one paper will come out mid-March called Preparing for the Intelligence Explosion. And that's really a kind of foundational paper for the sorts of things we're interested in, where it's really trying to make the case, firstly, for the idea that AI would drive at least a century's worth of technological change in less than a decade. And then secondly, really work through all of the challenges that we would have to face. So not merely misalignment, not merely biorisk, but other new weapons of mass destruction, AI's impact on our ability to reason well, or perhaps ability to augment how well we reason, the challenge of digital rights, challenge of governance of our newly valuable resources, including resources in space, and many more, and argues that we can't take the strategy merely of saying, OK, we're going to just punt this to align superintelligence. Then there's other work. I don't know exactly when it'll come out because it's work in progress, but it's kind of work that's really close to my heart on what I'm calling better futures, but the idea of just even if we avoid all of like the major catastrophes, extinction, intense concentration of power, and so on, how can we get not just from that sort of future, which is like, OK, but instead get to something that's really very good, like something that's 90% of the value that we might possibly be able to achieve. Because I think like even if we do avoid those catastrophes, probably we still lose out on most value. And this is something that I think is like very important, very neglected, something that benefits from people with a philosophical background as well. And yeah, hoping for that work to come out in the next few months.
Cool. Yeah, the main project that I've been working on recently is this risk of extreme power concentration. So we really focused on the most intense type of power concentration. So we're kind of currently finishing up a paper about the risk that just one person or maybe a group of kind of fewer than 10 people could use superhuman AI to seize complete control over the United States. And then we also think that from there, they could probably get control over the entire world. So really just talking about trying to lay out in as much detail as possible the most plausible threat models for one person becoming world dictator. And so I've also done an 80K podcast that's going to be out next month. I think it's slightly shorter than Will's, maybe just 2.5 hours. So really like listening. And other research I've been doing recently is exploring further some previous ideas around the intelligence explosion. So there's a piece that's coming out hopefully next month that asks the question of if there's a feedback loop where AIs improve AIs, which improve AIs further, just keeping the amount of computer hardware fixed. So you're just kind of improving the software and the algorithms and the data that's running on that hardware without actually needing to build any more chips. How far could that process go? If we start off with AIs that can just about fully automate all of the research tasks that are involved in AI research, does that get us all the way to kind of godlike superintelligence, or does it get us some of the way to kind of like 250 IQ equivalent AIs in all areas? Or what are the different probabilities of different levels of highly superhuman AIs that you could get through that process that doesn't go through the kind of slow process of producing new chips that does take months and months. And there's another paper also about the intelligence explosion that kind of zooms out and looks at not just the software intelligence explosion that I was just discussing, but the other feedback loops that could be involved in a broader intelligence explosion. So also kind of using AIs to design better chips, which though it has longer feedback loops, would kind of open up new avenues for progress. As current chips are quite far from what is likely to be theoretically possible, and also including the industrial intelligence explosion, where you have robots that are building new fabs which make chips. So then in that final version, you've got AI working on all the different routes for improving AI progress on a kind of broad industrial intelligence explosion. And so that paper kind of explores the different types of intelligence explosion that could happen and their implications. So for example, in the case where there's a software-only intelligence explosion, that could involve just one organization or project being the only entity that controls superintelligence, because they can kind of develop it themselves once they get that critical threshold where they've got enough chips to fully automate AI research and then kind of move upwards from there. Whereas on the industrial intelligence explosion, because you're kind of automating manufacturing and you're essentially automating the whole semiconductor supply chain, that kind of intelligence explosion distributes power much more broadly across the many different countries and companies that are involved in that supply chain. So that paper is actually already up on our website, and that website's going to be launched next month as well.
All right, you guys have been busy, but the launch has even happened. So maybe, Will, let's start with something you mentioned in your intro just now. You're making the argument that we can't just punt most of our decision-making to a super-aligned intelligence in the future. First of all, how do you distinguish between things that we can and can't sort of defer to a world where we have superintelligence, and for that latter category, what's the sort of nature of the problem that makes that infeasible?
Sure, yeah. So very natural thought. I like to think about it just in terms of labor. So we have a certain amount of human labor that we're putting towards these challenges, but we're going to have enormous quantities of AI labor that we could be putting towards the solving these challenges, perhaps not even in the too distant future. So the thought is like, well, isn't anything that you do now just a drop in the bucket compared to all that work that could happen in the future? And I think there's a few reasons why the answer's no, at least to punting, at least sometimes. Where for one thing, there's often windows of opportunity that we only have available now. So take concentration of power. At the moment, it is not perfectly known who is going to end up at the top of the power distribution after an intelligence explosion. So even though it looks likely that the US will win the race, it's still not guaranteed compared to China. We don't know who will be president at the time. And that means that we're kind of like behind this veil of ignorance. So at the moment, it's in everyone's self-interest to try and make agreements so that we don't result in an outcome that has some intense concentration of power and it's more widely distributed. However, after that point in time, then we will know who's at the top of the heap. And whoever does have power at the time, well, why would they now want to redistribute it? Maybe they will if they're magnanimous, but maybe not. Other cases of time lags are where you've just got to deal with humans and human institutions. So if we wanted some new treaty or arrangement that involved governance of space resources or other unclaimed resources, that's going to take time. That will take, I mean, years would be like really kind of optimistic, fast. And so that's not something I think that we can merely punt to after, because it's more like it goes in calendar time. And then the final thing is I think there's lots of stuff that we could do now to ensure that we do in fact use the AI labor at the time that we can. So I really think it's quite contingent the extent to which decision makers in particular are relying on super intelligent and aligned AI advice over this crucial kind of decade when we're getting very, very rapid technological change. And I think the extent to which that's being used, also the nature of the advice. So is the AI giving political decision makers advice merely on how they can advance their narrow self-interest, or are they giving kind of more cooperative, more pro-social advice? These things, I think, can be quite sensitively dependent on things that are happening now, like including kind of regulations and norms and so on. And so, yeah, that's why in some of these cases, I think, actually, there's a lot of work that that is to be done now.
Yeah. So to zoom in on just the first of those ideas you mentioned, that we have a narrow opportunity before concentrations of power are really sort of crystallized. Yeah, I'm really curious to pick both of your brains, maybe especially you, Tom. You've been thinking about this rather extreme scenario where one or as few as a dozen people have control over an entire country.
Yep.
Why zoom in on such an extreme sort of spiky scenario in terms of power in one group? And how are you thinking about the sort of relative badness of that versus other related bad outcomes that might seem more familiar?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think that the kind of really tiny number of people scenario is probably kind of most important overall when you weight it by its badness and its probability, compared to scenarios where there's maybe hundreds or thousands of people involved. But I still think that those other scenarios are important. So a few of the things that go into that, the nature of AI is that it unlike previous technologies, will allow like really, really extreme concentrations of power. So the simple case is that a company develops superintelligence, and now all the superintelligent AIs in the world are secretly loyal to one particular person. So now that technology has inherently embedded a kind of a really extreme concentration of power. So whereas historically it was hard to get concentrations of power that were nearly as intense as that, with AI, it will be possible for one person to have absolute unchecked power, and that person could just ignore what anyone else wants. Whereas historically, say, even with dictators like Stalin and Hitler, though they had very large amounts of power, it wasn't strictly absolute because they still relied on many other people to kind of enforce their will over the country. They still relied on the cooperation of their country. And so they couldn't do arbitrary things. They couldn't be like, okay, no one's going to eat for the next week on my whim. Whereas if now we live in a world where all the economy is kind of automated by AI, and all of the AIs in the military and the economy are all secretly loyal or explicitly loyal to one particular person, then that person could just do literally whatever they like. So that the nature of AI technology just makes these really intense concentrations of power much more plausible than they would have been historically. And I think if previous dictators had access to that technology, they would have used it to concentrate power in themselves in that really extreme way. There's then a question of how we compare the badness of, say, a one-person concentration of power with 1,000. And I think thinking about this is pretty early stage. But one way I think about it, I think thanks to Will actually for raising this frame, is that we want to get a kind of diversity of perspectives and opinions into the kind of to have influence over the long-term future. So if you have just one person, they might have a particular perspective which is quite idiosyncratic. They might have some values that are not shared by many other people. And then because they don't have to speak to anyone else, they don't have to compromise with anyone else, it's just their particular values that end up getting kind of spread across the stars, over the long term. And that could leave, very easily just leave, most or all value on the table if their values didn't capture what really matters. If you have, now 1,000 people, then there's a few different dynamics which come into play. The first is that now there's just a greater diversity of opinions already represented within those 1,000 people. So you're just much more likely, if there's a few things that really matter morally, or there's a few things that that ultimately we really want to be happening over the long run, it's just much more likely that one of the 1,000 people is going to already care about something or care about some seed that will grow into that. But in addition to that, it's also more likely that those people are going to kind of discuss amongst themselves what they should do and kind of debate. And so you get a natural kind of source of reflection and kind of an improvement of ideas over time through the process of this 1,000 people deciding what they actually want to do and kind of trying to coordinate with each other. So that kind of builds in some reflection that I think is also going to be quite important. In addition, when multiple people are kind of coordinating with one another about what to do, they typically coordinate around pro-social aims. So whereas individually, each of those 1,000 people may be somewhat selfish, when they open that conversation about how should we use society's resources, what should we do with the stars, they will tend to kind of lean into the better sides of their nature and the more kind of pro-social, moral aspects of their desires when trying to do that coordination. So they're not going to propose, let's just kind of glorify me personally as we go across the stars, because they know that's not going to land. So the act of having to coordinate will kind of lead the discussion to be focused on the parts that are kind of more pro-social. So for reasons like that, I feel like significantly more worried about like a one-person scenario than 1,000, although 1,000 still is nowhere near enough. One final point I'll make is that there's also a selection pressure where if you end up with one person, it's unusually likely that person was very power-seeking, maybe unusually likely that they're narcissistic, psychopathic, maybe even sadistic. To the extent you've got a greater number of people that have ended up seizing power, it seems at least somewhat more probable that that selection pressure is weaker. So you're selecting less strongly for those really problematic character traits.
I think that's a very compelling case that this is an extremely scary outcome. But I wonder if you could talk a bit about the choice to research and talk about it in public. I mean, you might think that outlining specifics of how a small group could seize power is infohazardous. How do you weigh that trade-off?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is something we're like actively discussing at the moment, actually. So far, Tom and Lucas, who've been co-authoring on this paper, is like quite cautious and choosy in terms of like what media to do. So 80,000 hours is like very exposed to people who are likely to be trying to defend against concentration of power rather than seizing power themselves. Whereas there was discussion from wider outreach, and it was like, okay, maybe not now. But that we have been getting pitched more recently on actually having something really quite like wide, like really quite wide promotion, precisely just so that you wake up the people who might be worried about this. And it's like a tough trade-off. But I think there are compelling cases for thinking that like the gains you get from alerting people who are not in political power at the moment, other countries other than the US, like employees within the labs and so on, are larger than the costs from making it even more likely that the power-seeking individuals are like, oh, that's an interesting idea.
Yeah, a couple of other considerations there. If we kind of sound the alarm earlier, before perhaps there's one particular AI developer that looks likely to kind of win the race to superhuman AI, then it's going to look less like we're pointing fingers at particular people or particular organizations. And so it'll be easier, I think, then to avoid polarization and avoid some organizations saying, oh, you're just saying this to target us, and it becoming very polarized. And I think really to make this decision, you want to try and think about the nuts and bolts about, okay, if we went really big here, is there a risk that the current kind of administration in the US would then, as a result of hearing about this, actually actively try and do a kind of centralized manhandling project because they think it would get them power? What kind of Would they actually be able to do that without congressional oversight? What are the kind of mechanisms available to them for actually making that happen under various kind of amounts of time? And if, for example, it looks like it could be quite hard for that to happen quickly, because it would involve nationalization of a huge, hundreds of $billion industry, then that would cut against the main concern with we're talking about this more loudly.
Makes sense. I want to switch topics a bit to talk about this notion of the industrial explosion. Can you talk a bit about what that is, why we should care about it, and in particular, how should we be preparing now for potential explosive growth and capabilities in the near future?
Sure, yeah. So people in general, kind of in this kind of wider community, have tended to focus on the intelligence explosion, and in particular, the AI designing better software that enables AI to design better software.
Yeah.
The industrial explosion is a different sort of recursive feedback loop, where you have robots and AI that are building more robots and more AI. And this will come after the software part of the intelligence explosion. I think it's neglected and extremely important, however, for a few reasons. One is I think we both think it's more likely to happen than the software only part. So I normally defer to Tom on likelihoods of these things, but I think the software feedback loop and getting accelerating progress there, I don't know why I'm saying you're on stage, but you think it's like 50-50 or something that happens at all. There's still be a wave of advance, but not something that accelerates in the classic singularity stories. However, with the industrial explosion, and that's because you're limited by compute. However, with the industrial explosion, okay, you've got self-replicating factories, in fact, an entire self-replicating industrial economy. You just need the efficiency of that process to increase even just a little bit in order to get accelerating growth, because you've got two factories. They're going to produce twice as much stuff. So if in the course of the stuff that they produce, that including AI is helping to make the process more efficient, if that just increases the efficiency of the process a little bit, then a doubling of the industrial base will give you more than a doubling of output, and you've got accelerating growth. So why is this so important? Well, one, I think, it's more likely to happen. Second, I think the rates of change that you could get might end up just as fast as the software aspect. So the arguments here are a little esoteric, but you can look at biological machines as a kind of proof of concept of how fast you can get a replication of machines. So fruit flies can double their biomass in about a week, or even less than a week in ideal conditions. So we have this proof of concept that a machine with a brain, with manipulators, with ability to move, to take in fuel, that was designed by this wholly blind process, can have a doubling time on the order of a week. So maybe at the peak, we can do even better than that. And then secondly, the industrial explosion just has very large scale as well, where on Earth, the economy could use over 1,000 times more energy than we currently use, just from solar power. And then moving to solar power in space, that could increase 1 billion-fold again. So it's because it's so sustained, firstly, that just means you're really going through a very large number of orders of magnitude, very large progress through the tech tree, and then also gives you more time to be speeding up to this very high rate. And then the final thing is I think that authoritarian countries have a particular advantage in the industrial explosion for two reasons. One is that authoritarian countries are able to maintain a higher savings rate than democratic countries. And this is true historically, where if you look at Stalinist Russia, there's just enormous industrial growth because the people, the workers are poor. All of the output is getting not consumed, but reinvested into more industrial growth. And then secondly, authoritarian countries can also skirt environmental regulations or just ignore them as a whole. And I still think the software part is more important to focus on in general. It's just that people, it's almost like they think things end there. That's the only thing. Whereas actually this industrial explosion, I'd love to have more kind of analysis and reasoning through of it.
Makes sense. So would you expect then the two to go hand in hand? Like you mentioned that maybe one of the big limiting factors on the software explosion is compute. If we have then self-replicating factories, and among the things that they're making is more chips and more hardware, would you see both of these then getting on some like hyper exponential trajectory, or is there some like fundamental limit to intelligence in the way that there isn't to like raw material in the solar system?
Yeah, I think it's very likely that as you increase compute inputs, you're going to increase the pace of software progress. And so you've got now twice as much compute. That means you can run twice as many experiments. It also means you can run twice as many AI researchers thinking about better AI algorithms. And so I think, yeah, during an industrial explosion, all the inputs to software progress will be growing increasingly fast. And so it would be very surprising if software progress itself wasn't also accelerating. So while during the kind of software-only intelligence explosion, you're just going to have software growing very, perhaps increasingly quickly, where the amount of compute may be growing, fairly slowly. During the industrial intelligence explosion, we're probably going to see all parts of all inputs to AI progress growing at an accelerating rate. So kind of number of fabs growing at an accelerating rate, the quality of AI chips growing at an accelerating rate, and also, again, the software growing at an accelerating rate as well. In terms of limits to intelligence, it's, there may well be limits at some point where it's like, for a certain task, there's some, absolute upper bound for how well the task can be performed and the efficiency at which it can be performed. But there's no signs that we're close to those limits with humans. And in fact, there's a huge range of human ability on different tasks. And even at the top, you find very large variance in terms of how well different humans can do different tasks. And then just the fact that with AI systems, you'll be able to train them with so much more compute on so much more data, suggests that the ceilings, if there are any, will be extremely high.
So I guess then the practical upshot, are there things that we can do now to prepare for scenarios and that have this sort of explosive growth dynamic?
Yeah. Do you want to start with the concentration of power stuff, and I can add?
Yeah, for sure. I think the work I've done on the software intelligence explosion has made me think it's very important to monitor the pace of internal software progress within AI organizations. What I expect is that there'll be an incremental process via which AI R&D is automated, and there'll be an incremental process by which the pace of progress within those organizations is accelerating. I think that's something that those organizations will be able to measure, just both by kind of standard ways of measuring the pace of algorithmic progress, by more kind of survey-based, social science-based ways of kind of looking at the deployment of AI systems in the workflows and looking at the productivity benefits. And I think that we should require that AI developers make those measurements and share the results with society more broadly. And the hope would be that if we can kind of get as broad an understanding as possible of this process as it begins to take off and it begins to accelerate, that there will become increasing consensus more broadly that it's not okay to just let one organization just kind of by themselves do a software intelligence explosion and within a year or so go from kind of human level to significantly superhuman systems. And so the kind of main intervention that I'd be recommending on the intelligence explosion side is good measurements of the pace at which this is happening, and then sharing that information as widely as possible. And then similarly for kind of other concerns about concentration of power, I think, again, like transparency and information sharing is like a kind of very reasonable thing to ask for, and also could kind of bootstrap itself into more significant interventions. So again, kind of asking AI companies to share information about how capable their AI systems are, who has access to those AI systems, how they're using them. And then as those capabilities become more and more extreme, and as it becomes clearer that potentially there's a small number of people in the organization who are using these systems, and that they have the ability to use them for things like political lobbying, and other kind of forms of kind of illegitimate power seeking, that hopefully, as people kind of get increasing information that that's happening, allows kind of broader society to wake up to just how scary this is. and demand kind of greater control. And I think what's nice about this transparency stuff is it really works both for power concentration risks, the risk of one person seizing power or a small group, but also for misalignment risks. And so whichever one you're worried about, if we encourage organizations to kind of share all of that information as widely as possible, then that, I think, gives us at least some opportunity for the rest of the world to demand kind of more stringent oversight.
I think tons to say. So I mean, on this kind of like preparing for the intelligence explosion or AGI preparedness vein, there's kind of meta or like cross-cutting approaches that tackle many different challenges all at once. And then there's kind of specific things. So within the cross-cutting, just ensuring that decision makers have more information and better information. I mean, that's just huge already, because it's like there's this, the most important event ever coming and people are just sleepwalking into it. Potentially also developing governance plans for that. Could be of the form of if-then commitments. So once you have AI that's automating 90% of machine learning research, then do X, Y, Z. I've done a bit of work calling for kind of global constitutional convention. So you define this bar, which is taking what is in fact a gradual continuous process, turning it into a binary and saying, okay, this is the moment when the intelligence explosion begins. And then saying, okay, in that case, this is what should happen, where perhaps that's some sort of intense convention basically happening between like many different countries. I think another vein of the kind of cross-cutting work that I'm really excited about is differential AI development, diffusion, and deployment. So AI can be enormously helpful for helping us govern this period of transformative change. And this is something that Lise Gavrienthorpe has been working on. You can talk to her afterwards. But it's really quite contingent to me, I think, like how much are government advisors, government officials or advisors relying on very high quality AI advice over the course of this period, especially if we're still in the paradigm, which is what I expect, of very large amounts of spending on inference time compute, then it might literally just be a contingent question of what are people choosing to spend money on to buy the answers to. So one thing we're excited about is the idea of setting ourselves up for automated macro strategy research. So that on the eve of AGI or eve of the intelligence explosion, we're just paying perhaps quite large amounts of money for enormous amounts of inference time compute to help us figure out macro strategy and have a plan for the next 10 years. There's many other things, I think, in those like actively helpful AI applications. I think AI can be very useful for making international agreements and treaties as well. And then I think there's like a long tail of challenge-specific activities one can do as well. So I'd love more work on digital rights. So not just about whether systems are conscious, but what should we do given we won't know. Also, like what economic rights, political rights should digital beings have. I'm very keen for more work in space governance, which feels sci-fi now, but if you're getting explosive growth, then it's, maybe it's next decade that we need to tackle this. And then again, a kind of long tail of very specific challenges where I'd love there to be at least one person who's like a real expert on it within this wider community. So on drones and drone swarms, on nanotech, on like AI for very harmful persuasion. I think like, many other things in this category as well. Often it's just like we don't even know what we don't know in this area. And at least having one person would help us, have a much better understanding than we might right now.
Sure. So, I mean, that's a lot of threads, all of which seem important and urgent. But I'm just struck by how it's already difficult enough to make the basic case to policymakers and stakeholders of sort of what's coming. And I think one critique you often hear in the AICT community is we haven't yet perfected this art of really having a clear, concise message, especially when things come up in the news cycle like DeepSeek, and there's this sort of brief window to maybe make one concrete ask. So we have this question from Brandon Riggs in the audience, who's wondering, is there sort of a particular narrative or sort of high-level idea that it would make sense to sort of coalesce around at the moment if the AI community was to focus on calling for more transparency or more attention to concentration of power, or does it seem like the moment is premature for really rallying around one particular message?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think transparency is one thing we could coalesce around. I think it captures a lot of these different threats because there's often a common interest in preventing a lot of these catastrophes. Another thing we could rally around is something around once we get to human level systems, we need to slow down. I think a lot of these risks are significantly exacerbated by the possibility of zooming through to superintelligence and then racing through to kind of industrializing as quickly as possible and kind of automating the military as quickly as possible. So something around, a trigger point and then a slowdown, or like a trigger point and then we need to really be very careful and have lots of different eyes looking at this project. I think that would be a nice way of encapsulating a lot of these risks, and I think would also just be very broadly reasonable if people understood what's coming.
Yeah, I think I don't have a definitive answer at all, but I think something that we could do a lot more and could have done, I think, a lot more in the past is stuff that's just kind of non-normative or non-ideological even. So just spelling out, look, this is exactly what we expect to happen. So Epoch are doing this very well without then appending to it kind of policy recommendations. So the idea that you're going to have AI quickly move to superintelligence, then suddenly with this huge technological wave, potentially very rapid rates of industrial expansion. If people believe that, the world would be very different. I think the world would be a lot better. And that would involve all sorts of different preparation. And I kind of think that's a better message and more likely also to get uptake than something that's much more specific along the lines of, well, we'll get superintelligence, by default, you're all dead, therefore stop AI development. And then it's that really narrowed the range of people who might be receptive to these, worrying about transformative technological change versus other people who might be more concerned by the concentration of power angle or other things again.
Yeah, makes sense. I want to pivot to a few questions that are on a slightly more personal level. So it seems like a lot of people at this conference and in the broader community are in this position of maybe working on global health and development or policy, enjoying that work, feeling like it's impactful, and yet noticing that timelines keep getting shorter and shorter, and there's maybe a need to pivot and try to figure out what to do about AI. Do you have any advice for people who find themselves in that situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think my honest advice is just take it really seriously. I was definitely a long timelines person, and then started changing my view from about Palm GPT 3.5 kind of. At that point, it just seemed like progress on reasoning in particular was just going much faster. And then since then, it's just more and more updates in the same direction.
Yeah.
I think one thing I want to say is that having a kind of taking short timelines to AGI and taking kind of transformative technological advancement happening from there, taking that seriously can be combined with all sorts of other ethical worldviews. So you can be not long-termist at all. You can even not care about existential risk at all. But nonetheless, I still think that this is probably the most important thing to be thinking about. So for example, what will be the impact of this on the global poor? Will we be just wholly disenfranchised? Or will they have access to resources that might actually make them like much wealthier than they are today. Mm. The kind of underlying thought is like, if you think transformative AI is coming soon, it just impacts everything else. Yeah. And so even for people who are skeptical of long-termism, skeptical of existential risks themselves, I think it's still a super important thing to think about. I do think, like, as a community, we should have some, like, I think it would be very overconfident not to have like a good chunk of probability mass on long timelines, or even what I call like no timelines, where it's like just AI just never in fact generates this like very rapid transformative change. Where I find the inside view arguments very compelling now, but like this is still a minority view. Like super forecasters don't believe it. Metaculus doesn't really believe it. Economists, if you survey them, don't believe it. And so it's like, it would feel like a weird bet if it's like the entire EA movement is going on this like empirical prediction that is not yet widely shared among experts.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I don't think if you end up concluding like, no, I'm going to focus on the long or no timelines worlds, then like I think that's kind of reasonable too.
Yeah.
I just briefly add that I think in the last few years, in addition to kind of timelines seem like they're shorter, there's also just more concrete opportunities, organizations to work at that require kind of a range of skills. So I think, 5 years ago, thinking about how could someone get involved with kind of the AI risk space, there weren't that many great concrete opportunities to point to. Whereas I think now, if you're kind of reconsidering, then I think it is a good time to reconsider, because I think there are a much wider range of organizations, lobbying organizations that are being spun up that your skills might be relevant for.
Yeah. I guess starting next month, you guys will be at the newest of said organizations. Can you talk a bit about sort of the rationale for starting a new org, given that there's research going on at Open Phil, at other places that might seem similar?
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'll let you comment on Open Phil, or maybe I should because I'm not there. I don't know. I actually do think there's a big vacuum. So the closure of the Future of Humanity Institute. But also just for years before that, they were constrained. They weren't allowed to hire. They weren't allowed to receive money. Then the Open Phil Worldview Investigations team is like fantastic, but very small, and I think unlikely to kind of grow itself. And so it seemed to me like, okay, people are waking up to AI, like near-term AI, as they should be. Huge allocation of effort towards AI, technical AI safety and AI governance, which again is great, but then it felt like there's this kind of chasm in terms of issues kind of beyond that. And that's why it's like, okay, we wanted to focus on something within that. And then did discuss like, should this be part of another organization? And yeah, one thing I got was just, it's too weird. Like there's a lot of organizations that quite rightly want to just be acting within the Overton window. We're quite explicitly looking for stuff that's currently outside of the Overton window, and so that motivated having something new.
Yeah, makes sense. Another question on a sort of more personal note is just how does thinking about the possibility of transformative AI soon impact you guys personally? Does it change anything about the way you're living your lives day to day?
Yeah, so I mean, in my own case, I'll let you comment too. Up until about last November, I was just like, I was in this mode of like, what a time to be alive. So exciting, the models are amazing. Like that really actually is like very exciting. Just, I feel like I'm being supercharged already, even with the kind of current LLMs, especially if you're doing like weirdo research that hits on all sorts of different disciplines that you don't know about. The language models are amazing. And that was a really good state to be in. I admit that since then, I've just, stress has like taken over a bit more.
I think you're not alone in that, yeah.
Yeah, it's annoying. I like, from a consequentialist perspective, I think it would be better if I was in the like, more like excited, optimistic mode. And why is that? I think like the new administration is a cause of great stress for me. The like O1 like reasoning models. I mean, even though in fact, I think like that's an optimistic development from the perspective of the world, because having a lot of instance time compute will give you a more gradual transition to AGI, or like AGI starts off expensive and then gets cheaper. That's like really good. Chain of thought, I think, is really good for now. Like in general, having kind of oracles for like AI that's more oracular rather than more agentic, I think is good. Nonetheless, it's just, it feels even more real. And yeah, that's a kind of, that's a challenge. That said, I was just at the Existential Security Summit and around here. It's been very heartening for me and actually quite inspiring, the extent to which people in the real world, not quite different from online perhaps, are really not in this kind of like despair, despondency. Instead, it's like, okay, this is the time, let's get energized, let's do it. And that's, yeah, inspiring for me.
Nice.
Yeah, I think my relationship with this stuff has been complicated. Historically, I think I had much more of an intellectual relationship with with the possibilities at stake, and much less kind of emotionally resonating with the reality of it. And that worked fairly well. I think you can operate just fine. But yeah, recently I think with AI capabilities going much faster than I had expected over the last couple of years, and I think just really it becoming quite clear that some of my, I think, naive hopes around the organizations developing these systems really, having good safety teams and doing things very methodically and carefully, seems like it probably just isn't going to happen, and that it seems like quite possible that there's just going to be a real race just to develop these systems very quickly. Has made me feel quite scared, and yeah, I'm still kind of reorienting to that and thinking through how likely do I really think it is that the future is going to be awful. But yeah, over the last few months, it has begun to feel a lot more real.
Well, thank you guys for, despite the scary times, putting your time and energy towards thinking through these outside the Overton window questions. I think you made a compelling case for them being both neglected and important, and hopefully you guys agree. We have no more time here in this room for questions, but if you want to continue the discussion, I do encourage you to follow us upstairs to Junior Ballroom 4 for office hours. But for now, please join me in thanking Will and Tom.
Thanks so much.